Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and in this video we're going to take a look at a few things, but primarily the goal is to develop a method for presenting a form view that will allow us to either create a new object or update an existing object of the same type. We'll be looking at creating a form along with a FormViewModel that will help us do that along with an enum that conforms to the SwiftUI view protocol so that we can use it to present the form for our correct purpose, either an update or a new object. In addition, we'll also be seeing how we can use keyPaths for properties in our ViewModel so that we can control the field focus in our form. If this is something that you want to learn, then keep watching. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. As with most of my videos, I've created a starter project and I encourage you to download it and work along with me. Or download the completed project after watching the video so that you can have a reference in the future. There's a considerable amount of coding done already here, so let me show you what's going on. Here's what we're going to be building. On the first launch of this application, there are no contacts. If I tap on the plus button, I can create a contact like this. When the form appears, the focus is set on the first field and the keyboard appears. So I can enter this first name. When I tap the Enter key, the focus shifts to the next field entry and will continue to do that each time I enter into the field and press Return. It just cycles through all the fields. When complete, I can add it, and it gets added back to the list and displayed. Now, if I tap the Edit button, that same form appears, but this time it says Update instead of Add, and it's pre-populated by my contact details, and no focus has been set. I'm in view mode. I can, however, tap in and edit one of the fields. If I exit the app and remove it from memory, I can launch it again, and you'll see that the data has persisted. Now this isn't the point of this video, so I've pre-coded that persistence part in the starter project, and I'll walk you through it shortly. We can even swipe to delete an item that's removed. Now this is a pretty typical scenario in a lot of applications. You have a list of objects and you want to be able to perform CRUD operations on them. Create, read, update, delete. In addition, we want to be able to persist so that the items have been saved between sessions. As I said, this video is not about the CRUD operations. There's lots of tutorials on how to do those based on the data storage type that you're using, whether that be core data, Firebase, CloudKit, Realm, etc. In my example, I'm just using local document storage, and I'm just saving the data as a JSON file. My model is a contact, and we'll be displaying a list of them so it conforms to the identifiable protocol. And because we want to encode and decode the JSON, it's also codable. There are just 4 properties here. I also have a static property that's the name of the file that I'll use to create and load from our application's document directory. In store.swift, we see it's an observable object that we will inject into the environment, so it will be available to all of our views, and it has that published array of contacts. In addition, there are a number of the pre-coded CRUD functions, and they do what they need to. You don't really have to know how these functions work, and they'll change based on your backend database. In my case, we append a new contact to an array when we create one. When we load, we use an extension on File Manager to create the document that's in our static property, and then we decode it to populate our contacts array. When I update, it checks the ID of a contact we provide to see if it matches one in the array, and then simply replaces it. In the delete function, we'll get the offset from our list when we swipe and remove it from the array. In the cases where we create, update, and delete, we also call a save function, and that will encode the data and write it back to the file in the documents directory. And the other thing that we do when we instantiate this class is I go ahead and load, so that's why on first launch there are no contacts. But after subsequent launches, it finds them and the list gets updated. App entry is the location that's executed when the app launches. And here I create a state object that's our store, thus loading any existing contacts, and then it injects it into the environment. Contacts list view is where we display our list of contacts, and it's embedded in a navigation view with a trailing bar button item, where the action is yet to be completed. And this will present us with that form so that we can add a new contact. What you don't see in the preview, however, is our list of contacts because, if you recall, the contacts array in our environment store object is empty. Now, wouldn't it be nice in the design phase of this app if we could actually see a sample list of contacts? Let me show you now what I do to enable this. In our model for contacts, create a new static property called sample contacts that'll return an array of contact. In the body, create an array that has at least 2 contacts. I'll let you decide who your sample contacts are. I'm just going to add 2 quickly here. One that's my contact information, and a second one for some fictional character at Apple. In the store, we can create a Boolean property that we'll call preview, but not initialized just yet. This means that we'll need to have an initializer. Well, we want the default to be false because when we launch in the simulator, we don't want to have any preview content. However, in our preview, we do. So let's do that as an initializer parameter. Now we can initialize our preview property with the one passed in during initialization. With the default value in the parameter, it means that we do not have to specify it when initializing. And that's what we've done when we created our environment object, which is what we want normally. However, if we specify a preview to be true, we want to set our contacts array to be that sample array of contact. Else we'll call the load contacts function. This doesn't break our existing code because when we instantiate in the app entry, we don't pass in a preview property, so it just defaults to false. Now the one thing I want to do also is to execute the save contacts function only if we're not in preview mode. So I can do a return if so. In the contacts list view, nothing has changed. But for our preview, since we inject an instance of our store into the environment, I'm going to specify preview though with a true value, thus overriding the default. So now as you see in our preview, I get my 2 sample items. It looks pretty good. And I see that there's an edit button, and that edit button has no action yet. It's going to present our form, pre-populated this time with the selected contacts information waiting for edits. Remember, we had no action for the create button either. There's also a delete function on this list that performs the store's delete function, and it uses the index set to know which one to delete. In preview mode then, we see that we can delete by swiping from the right. However, no saving takes place, so when I stop and start the preview, the defaults appear. Let's work on that form now. In order to let my form serve 2 purposes, I'm going to use an observable object that I'm going to call FormViewModel. So first, let's create a folder group and call it form. Inside that group, create a new SwiftUI file and call it FormViewModel. Create a new class of the same name that conforms to the observable object protocol. Now the form is going to have 3 published properties corresponding to the 3 properties that we need to update our model. So we can give them the same names and initialize them as empty strings. So let me just copy them and make those adjustments. We're missing the ID property, but this will only exist if we're updating and will not be changing it. So let's create an optional ID property that's a string. Now I'll want to know when I'm updating and when I'm just adding a new one. So I'm going to create one more computed property that's called updating. That's a Boolean, and it will be determined by whether or not the ID is nil. So I'm going to need two different initializers depending on whether or not I'm updating or creating a new contact. Well, the first one is fine. Our published properties are all going to be the default empty string and will not be passing in an ID. So it'll just be the default initializer. Nothing needs to be initialized. In the case where we're updating, however, we'll be passing in a contact to be updated, so we can create a second initializer and assign all of the properties to our published properties, including the ID. Now there's one more computed property, and that's the one where it will allow me to disable the update and create button if any of my fields are empty. So I'm going to call this incomplete, and it'll be a Boolean, and it'll return true if any of my properties are empty. Let's design our form view now. So within that groups folder, create a new SwiftUI file and call it FormView. We'll need three things. We're going to need access to our data store. So create an environment object of type store. And let's also inject that into the preview as well. We're also going to be embedding this view in a navigation view with a navigation toolbar button that will do the work, but also dismiss the view. So we'll need an environment variable to the keyPath dismiss. And thirdly, we'll need access to our FormViewModel so that we can instantiate that as a state object, and I'll call it ViewModel. And then again, to stop the preview from complaining, we'll also need to add an instance of our FormViewModel. In the body, let's create a navigation view, and inside there, we'll create a form. Our form will have three text fields, one for each of the published properties of our view model. The first one being our first name, and that's what we'll use for the placeholder string, and it'll be bound to our view model's first name. So we can just copy that 2 more times and replace the strings and the bound property. For the first 2 text fields, the default modifiers are fine. We'll want it to start with a capital letter. But for the email address, we'll want to turn off the auto capitalization and also change the keyboard type to be an email address. I'm going to add a navigation title using the string contact. And then I'm going to change the navigation bar title display mode to be inline. Now we can create our toolbar buttons. So we'll create a toolbar, and inside there we'll create 2 toolbar items. The first one will have a placement of navigation bar leading, and the button title is just going to say cancel, and the only thing that that's going to do is to call our environment's dismiss function. For the second toolbar item, the placement will be navigation bar trailing. And this time, though, the text or the string on the button will depend on whether or not we're updating. So if the view model is updating, we'll use update. Otherwise, it'll say add. For the action, it too will be determined by the value of the updating property. If it's updating, we'll need to execute an update function. So let's just write one in right now called update contact, and we'll code that in just a second. And if it's not, we'll need another function that will be the create the contact. But we don't want this button to be enabled if it's incomplete. So we'll say it's disabled if our view model is incomplete. So let's create those two functions then. For update contact, we know that we must have access to a contact that was passed in to our view model. So there must also be an ID property. So we can create a new contact using all of the properties in our view model, and we can unwrap that ID property because we know it exists. And then they get assigned to all of the different properties. And then we can store the update function passing in that contact, and then call the dismiss function to dismiss the view. Well, create contact is almost the same, except that we don't have an ID. So I'm going to copy the first function and change it to create contact. And I can remove the ID and change the function that it calls from our store to be create and pass in that contact. Now in Content View, we'll need some way to present the modal sheet. And there are two ways that we can do that. You can bind the modal sheet to a Boolean isPresented property or to an item that's an optional identifiable object. And when you do that, you're provided with an instance of that object. Now, here's the clever part. This object can be any type of identifiable object. So I'm going to use an enum with two cases, new and update. So in the form group, create a new Swift file and call it FormType. Inside there, create an enum that conforms to the identifiable protocol called FormType with those two cases, new and update. Because it's identifiable, it requires an ID property. But that can be a computed property, so let's just create one that's a string, and we'll switch on self and assign a unique string to each case. And I'll just use the string representation of the case. Now you're probably wondering why I didn't just use an associated type and return the case's raw value. Well, the reason is that I want to do more with this, and this is the really clever part. And I can't take credit for it, I just can't remember where I learned this from. First, I'm going to provide an associated value for the update, and that's going to be a contact type. Now I can change the import to import SwiftUI and conform the enum to a view protocol. But when I do that, it requires a body property of SomeView. Well, we've got two cases. So let's switch on self, and the view that will return in the case of new will be the form view, and it requires a view model, but with no contact being passed in. In the case of an update, however, we're going to return the form view, which requires the FormViewModel again, but this time we'll pass in the associated value that is that contact. We have everything we need now to proceed in Contacts List View. So we can create an optional state property that is of type FormType. Then, when we tap on the Edit button, we assign the form type to the case update, passing in the current contact. When we tap on the Add button on the navigation bar, we'll set the form type to the new case. And now that it's set, it's going to allow us to trigger a sheet. And we'll use the modifier based on the item that's being bound to our form type. And this provides us with a form type that we can use for the view to present. And what that is that form type. Remember, our form type conforms to a view property, and therefore it's a view. So, depending on what the form type is, that's going to be the view that's presented by our sheet. This is just the slickest thing. And we could even do this even shorter using shorthand. When we first run our app, there are no contacts. So let me tap on the plus button and add a couple of contacts like this. That seems to work. Let me tap on the Edit button and edit one of our contacts. Looks like I have to edit that string for the update in my code though. The edit is reflected in the list, but has it persisted? First, let me fix that update string. When I run again, I see that my two items have indeed persisted. Let me add one more contact. Let me stop, run again, and they persisted. So let me try the delete functionality. Stop, run again, and it looks like we're good. However, there's something that I failed to check, and I'm guilty of this in the past too. I've been testing this by using my attached keyboard on the simulator. Let me run again and start a new contact. However, I'm going to go to the I/O menu and uncheck the Connect Hardware keyboard, which is going to force me to use the simulator keyboard, which is how the iPhone users need to use it. First of all, I have to tap into that first field to start adding. That's a wasted step. I want this to be automatic. Otherwise, why would I have requested to create a new contact? Then when I do enter the field, the keyboard appears so I can enter a name, but when I press the Enter key, it doesn't go on to the next field. Rather, the keyboard gets dismissed. I have to tap into the next field to get it back again. This I need to fix. At WWDC 2021, we were introduced to a FocusState property wrapper that allows us to set the focus of our objects in a view. In a form, this is particularly useful because when I finish entering information on one field and hit the Enter key, I want to move the focus on to the next field. I read Twitter every day and I follow a lot of Swift devs who are a lot smarter than me, and I learn something pretty much every day. And this is what I learned recently. I learned about this blog called Nil Coalescing, and I'll leave a link in the description below. It's well worth checking out. One of the posts was about using keypaths to drive programmatic focus. This is actually very clever, so let me show you how you can use this in our solution. Since we have a FormViewModel class, each of our text views published properties has a keypath. And the keypath to the first name property is /FormViewModel, the type name or the class name, .firstName. For the last name, it's similar, but last name, and one for email as well. We can use this keypath type as our FocusState type. And since it's a different keypath each time, we can use the any keypath type to define it as an optional. So back in our form view, let's create the FocusState property we'll call Focus. That's of type any keypath optional. Now, when we enter any one of our text fields, we can set the focus to the corresponding keypath. So for the first name field then, the focus modifier is bound to the FocusState property, and it equals the FocusViewModel's first name keypath. So let me just copy that same modifier to the other two text fields and change the keypath to the corresponding one. So how is this going to be useful? Well, when we hit the Enter key in the keyboard, it initiates an onCommit function that we can add as an additional property to each one of our text fields. So let's create a function that we can call then for our onCommit. We're going to call that nextFocus. Well, we can switch on our FocusState property. And in the case where the FocusState is the keypath for the FormViewModel's first name, we'll set the focus to the next keypath, which is the last name. In the case where it's the last name, we'll move on to focus for the email keypath. And then when it's email, we'll cycle back to the first name. And then our switch needs to be all-inclusive, so we'll just add a default with a break. Now then, I can add that onCommit property to each one of our text fields and simply call that function as the closure. Let me run now, and when I tap on the New Contact button, up pops the form, but I still have to tap into that first field, so I'll fix that very shortly. However, when I enter a first name, I can now tap on the return, and I get placed into the last name field. And when I finish here and press enter once more, I am in the email field. And then after the email field, it cycles back to the first name. And then when I tap on the add button, the keyboard disappears and the item gets added as expected. When I tap on the edit button, I don't get any field entry, which is great. But if I tap in a field, the keyboard appears, but I have no way of dismissing it. So if there are lots of fields, they might be covered by that keyboard. So I'll need a button to allow me to dismiss the keyboard so that I can see other fields. First then, when the view appears, and only if it's a new contact, I want the cursor to be automatically placed in the text field. So I'm going to start by creating an onAppear function that will check first to see if we're not in the ViewModel's upstating stage. And if we're not, I'm going to set the focus to the first name keyPath for our FormViewModel. Let me test this. The focus doesn't appear to be set. Well, it seems that onAppear is actually called when the view is added to the memory graph as opposed to when it actually appears on the screen. And setting the focus state before it appears on the screen just doesn't cut it. The solution that I found works for me is to initiate a slight delay. And we can do this with a new async sleep function. So we can turn onAppear into an asynchronous task unit of work and then try to await the task sleep function that requires nanoseconds. So 500 million nanoseconds will be half a second. That should be enough before we actually set the focus state. Let me test. Great. Now it works. Now the final thing I want to be able to do is to dismiss that keyboard anytime, and that means setting the focus to nil. So I'm going to do that by adding a dismiss button to my keyboard toolbar. Now this is just another toolbar item, but with a different placement, which is the keyboard. So we can create an HDAC with a spacer so that I can push the button to the right. And then the button will be a system image with the string keyboard.chevron.compact.down. And then the action will simply set the focus to nil, dismissing the keyboard. If I test now, when I tap on the edit button, the keyboard doesn't appear. Perfect. When I tap into a field though, the keyboard appears, and I see that dismiss button on the keyboard toolbar on the right-hand side. Tapping it dismisses the keyboard. That's it. These three files in the form group can now serve you as a reference for future projects where you want to present a view for both adding and editing new objects. The view that gets presented can be any kind of view. It doesn't need to be one that includes a form view if you have something more specific in mind. It's just that FormView is so easy to use and it looks great. Now I hope you've learned something useful in this video. Make sure if you like the video to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below, and subscribe to my channel so that you can get notifications of new videos as they're released. Thanks for watching.